The story begins with a sound that engineers at the Kummersdorf testing grounds would remember for the rest of their lives. A low, metallic hum. Too steady to be a generator. Too cold. Too sharp. Too unnatural to be anything they had ever heard inside a laboratory. It was the winter of 1943. Snow lay in thick, uneven layers across the pine forest around the compound. Frost clung to the inside of windows, and the corridors smelled of hot wiring and old concrete. But the noise that morning belonged to none of that. It vibrated through metal tables, shook the enamel mugs on the desks, and made the technicians exchange uncertain glances. The hum was coming from Experiment 46, a project so restricted that even officers of the Waffen-SS needed written permission to cross its threshold. The test chamber had been sealed since midnight, and only 3 people were allowed inside. 2 physicists from the Luftwaffe Research Division and an SS Sturmbahnführer supervising the experiment. By dawn, none of the 3 men had emerged. At 0640, a junior engineer named Otto Berg finally approached the heavy steel door, his hands shaking despite the gloves. He reached for the viewing slit, breathed out a cloud of vapor, and scraped away the frost. What he saw inside made him step back, then step forward again, as if hoping he had misinterpreted the image. The chamber was lit by only one overhead lamp. Its light flickered, throwing long, distorted shadows across the concrete floor. The air inside shimmered faintly, as though heated by an invisible source. And in the center of the room, the metal apparatus, 2 meters tall, surrounded by insulated coils, seemed to be vibrating at the edges, as if its outline wasn't stable. The 3 men inside were not moving. Berg didn't scream. He didn't faint. He did what military engineers were trained to do: observe, analyze, and wait for orders. But as he stared at the scene, he realized something was terribly, fundamentally wrong with the machine in front of him. The coils that had been cold the previous day were now glowing a deep, unnatural blue. Thin fractures ran through the device's outer shell, leaking a faint mist that hovered close to the ground. He stepped back and ran toward the communications room. By 0710, a response team in protective gear had arrived. They unsealed the chamber with meticulous slowness, measuring radiation and temperature levels at every step. The hum stopped the moment the door lifted open, as if the machine itself sensed being observed. A stillness followed, so absolute that even the wind outside seemed to halt. The 3 men were dead. But not in a way that made sense. Their bodies showed no burns, no wounds, no chemical exposure. Their pupils were dilated. Their faces were frozen in expressions that weren't fear or pain, but something closer to confusion. All 3 appeared to have collapsed simultaneously. One of the physicists still held a clipboard in his hand. His pencil had snapped in 2. Within an hour, the corridor outside the chamber echoed with heavy boots. An SS Oberführer, tall and expressionless, inspected the room in silence. He was known among the engineers. Konrad Hecht, one of the key coordinators of the Reich's experimental weapons program. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice carried the kind of calm authority that made even senior officers straighten their posture. He examined the bodies, then the apparatus, then the data sheets. This project, Hecht said finally, never existed. The engineers exchanged stunned looks. Seal the room. Classify all documents. No reports will be filed. No records retained. Anyone who speaks of this is committing treason. Berg nodded instinctively, but as he glanced at the bodies again, especially the expression on Sturmbannführer Kappel's face, he felt a cold pressure settle at the back of his skull. He had been stationed at Kummersdorf for 2 years. He had seen failed engine tests, ruptured fuel cells, even an early rocket detonation. None of it resembled this, because whatever had happened in the chamber had not been mechanical. It felt like the aftermath of something that shouldn't have been possible. To understand why Experiment 46 was created, one must understand the desperation inside Germany's high command laboratories during the final years of the war. By early 1943, the Reich was searching for technologies that could change the conflict overnight. They needed weapons that didn't require mass production, didn't depend on oil supplies, and didn't rely on Luftwaffe superiority, which was rapidly slipping away. In that environment, even speculative research received attention. The device inside the chamber had officially been a prototype for high-frequency field testing. Unofficially, the project's documents hinted at something else, a theoretical attempt to manipulate localized atmospheric conditions, a boundary experiment, a field distortion, a possible energy phenomenon that might disable aircraft engines or disrupt communications. The idea had originated from a small group of physicists influenced by fringe theories, not occultism, not pseudoscience, but speculative physics that the Reich hoped might yield even the smallest advantage. Most scientists dismissed the concept immediately, but one influential figure didn't, General der Flieger Wilhelm Udet, who had supported several unconventional research proposals before his death. His endorsement had created a path for the project to continue quietly, long after his passing. By late 1943, the project had become fully absorbed into the SS research apparatus. That meant two things. First, secrecy. Second, no tolerance for failure. The experiment conducted that night had been routine. The apparatus was to be activated at minimal power for a stability test. The physicists were scheduled to record data for 15 minutes. Instead, something in the machine escalated beyond design parameters, a runaway effect, triggered by conditions no one had anticipated. The internal logs, what little remained of them, suggested a sudden spike in frequency output, a resonance event. The coils had begun to oscillate at increasing speed. Temperature inside the chamber had dropped instead of rising, contradicting every known behavior of such a device. Then the logs ended. Later that morning, Berg was summoned to a closed meeting along with 6 other specialists who had worked on the electrical components of the device. The room was dim, lit by a single lamp dangling above a long metal table. Hecht stood at the far end, flanked by 2 SS officers. "You will answer questions simply," Hecht said. "There will be no speculation." But the questions were unusual. Had anyone noticed electrical instability in the previous tests? Had anyone heard the strange hum before? Had any member of the team reported headaches, disorientation, or vertigo in recent weeks? Did anyone observe distortions in light, temperature, or sound? These weren't engineering questions. They sounded closer to medical evaluations or psychological assessments. When Berg's turn came, he hesitated before answering. He mentioned the faint metallic taste he had felt at midnight while calibrating the outer resistors. He mentioned the momentary flicker of the lights earlier that week. He mentioned a tremor he had attributed to exhaustion. Hecht listened without expression. "And last night," Hecht said, "did you sense anything unusual before the chamber was sealed?" Berg exhaled slowly. "The air felt charged," he said, "like before a storm, but colder." Hecht didn't react. He only nodded to the officers, who wrote something down. The questioning continued for an hour. When the engineers were dismissed, they were each handed a document to sign. Berg skimmed the page. It stated that they had participated in routine maintenance exercise number 12 and witnessed an electrical malfunction with casualties. Nowhere did it mention the experimental device. Nowhere did it mention the real nature of the test. The signatures were mandatory. That evening, long after the compound had fallen quiet, Berg returned to the corridor outside the sealed chamber. 2 SS guards stood at attention, rifles slung across their chests. The steel door had been welded shut. A fresh layer of paint concealed the seams. But even through the metal, Berg felt the cold. As he stared at the sealed entrance, a thought formed in his mind. An unscientific thought, but one he couldn't shake. The machine hadn't failed. It had succeeded at something no one understood, and that was why the experiment had been buried within hours. He turned away, walking back through the silent corridor. The light bulbs flickered once overhead, then steadied. In the distance, the forest wind pressed against the walls like a quiet, insistent warning. By morning, the official report would be complete. By evening, the families of the dead men would receive letters filled with lies, and somewhere behind that sealed door, the air would still feel cold. A cold that didn't belong to winter. A cold that belonged to whatever had awakened inside that chamber. The morning after the chamber was sealed, a thin layer of frost appeared on the outside of the steel door. No one noticed it at first. The corridor was cold, the building poorly insulated, and frost in winter was nothing unusual. But by noon, the frost had thickened into an opaque sheet, too uniform to be natural, too concentrated around the seams of the welded plate. The guards stationed there shifted nervously, their breath forming clouds in the air. One of them tapped the metal with the butt of his rifle. The sound echoed strangely, dull, muted, as if the metal behind the surface had changed. He frowned, but said nothing. Inside the administrative office, Konrad Hecht was reviewing new reports delivered by couriers from Peenemünde. His hands moved with their usual precision, but the lines on his forehead revealed a tension he would never admit. When an aide stepped into the room and whispered about unusual surface accumulation on the sealed chamber, Hecht stood up immediately. He reached the corridor minutes later. The frost had grown thicker. He pressed his gloved hand to the surface. The metal was cold, far colder than the building's ambient temperature. A kind of penetrating, unnatural cold that seemed to pulse beneath the skin of the door. "Bring thermal gauges," Hecht ordered. 2 technicians rushed in, positioning devices along the doorframe. Their readings alarmed even the least imaginative among them. The temperature inside the chamber, measured indirectly, was dropping. Not gradually, not predictably, but in sudden, irregular declines, as if pockets of air were collapsing into cold voids. "Is the cooling system still connected?" one technician asked. "There is no cooling system," another replied quietly. Hecht turned toward the welding marks along the edge of the door. "What we sealed," he murmured, "is not dormant." By late afternoon, the frost had spread outward along the concrete wall. Thin tendrils of ice traced along invisible imperfections in the surface, forming spiderweb-like patterns. The corridor's temperature dropped noticeably. Guards replaced one another every 30 minutes, not because of protocol, but because prolonged exposure left them shivering uncontrollably. In the workshop across the compound, Otto Berg worked on a set of calculations that Hecht had demanded earlier that day. He cross-referenced the device's expected frequency output with what little data had been recorded before the logs stopped. Nothing aligned. Every value seemed to contradict the laws of thermodynamics. A field generating cold? A resonance causing atmospheric drop instead of heat increase? It shouldn't have been possible. Berg looked at a sketch of the device, a cylindrical core surrounded by asymmetrical coils. He had worked on building those coils for months. He knew every bolt, every insulating layer. None of it could explain what was happening behind that sealed door. At 18:20, a runner burst into the workshop, panting from the cold. "You must come," the young man managed. "The Oberfuhrer wants you at the chamber. Now." Berg followed him across the yard. The snow cracked beneath their boots. The wind howled between the buildings. Yet when they entered the corridor, the stillness was suffocating. The frost now covered an entire section of the wall. Ice had formed along the floor. The air felt heavier, pressing on the lungs. Hecht stood in front of the chamber, arms crossed, jaw tight. "Tell me," he said to Berg without looking at him, "is there any scenario in which the device continues generating field output after complete shutdown?" "No, sir," Berg said. "It has no autonomous components, no internal power storage. It cannot operate without external supply. And yet the temperature is still falling." Hecht's voice was flat, but the implication was sharp as a blade. One of the SS guards pointed to the narrow crack between the wall and the floor. A faint mist, almost invisible, crept out like a slow exhale. It dissipated quickly in the corridor, but its presence made several men step back. "Open it," one officer said. "No." Hecht's answer was immediate. "If the temperature is dropping this rapidly, we cannot expose the compound. We contain it. We observe." "But if there are hazardous materials—" "There were no hazardous materials inside that chamber," Hecht interrupted coldly. "Which means something else is generating these effects. Until we understand what, no one enters." Berg stared at the frost. He remembered the hum. He remembered the shimmering air. And he realized suddenly that the experiment had not failed at all. It had produced something. Not an explosion, not radiation, but a phenomenon, a field, a state, a condition. But the question was, for how long would it continue? The following morning, Hecht held a closed briefing with a small group of officers and technicians. A large map of the facility lay across the central table. Red lines indicated temperature zones. Blue ink marked areas where ice had formed. "The anomaly has spread by 1.3 meters overnight," Hecht said. "At current progression, the corridor will become impassable within 2 days." "And after that?" asked an SS officer. Hecht didn't answer. He simply tapped the blueprint of the experimental device. "Before we sealed the chamber, the apparatus generated a field that no one fully understood. It is possible that the activation triggered a self-sustaining reaction." "Impossible," one technician whispered. "Then offer a better explanation." Silence followed. Berg cleared his throat. "What if the field is not sustaining itself," he said, "but collapsing slowly, like a wave losing energy. As it collapses, it absorbs heat from the surrounding environment." Hecht looked at him. "And when it finishes collapsing?" Berg hesitated. "We don't know what the final state looks like." That afternoon, a new problem emerged. The welding seams on the chamber door began to crack. Hairline fractures at first, barely visible to the naked eye. But by dusk, they lengthened, branching outward like veins of fractured glass. Pressure changes? Temperature differential? Or something inside pushing outward? The guards backed up, raising their rifles, although no weapon would matter against an unknown physical effect. Hecht arrived and examined the damage with a flashlight. The beam flickered each time it neared the cracks, as though the light itself was being distorted. Berg approached slowly. "Sir, the metal is deforming from the inside." "Yes," Hecht said quietly. "The chamber is no longer containing whatever was initiated last night." One guard swallowed hard. "Should we evacuate the building?" "Not yet," Hecht replied. "If this phenomenon is spatial, moving personnel may expose more of the facility. We isolate the corridor. Only essential staff remains." He turned to Berg. "Find a way to calculate when the structural failure will occur." Berg stared at the cracking seams. The metal didn't just look cold, it looked brittle. He touched the wall gingerly with his gloved hand. The vibration wasn't mechanical. It was rhythmic, almost like breathing. By midnight, an emergency engineering team installed reinforced bracing around the door. Thick steel supports were bolted into the concrete. Yet even as they worked, frost climbed up the beams in delicate crystalline patterns. When one technician leaned too close, his breath froze instantly. He backed away, coughing violently, clutching his chest. "Out!" Berg shouted. The man stumbled toward warmer air. Hecht watched silently, hands clasped behind his back. "As soon as the chamber was sealed," Berg said, "this reaction accelerated." "It was already active before that," Hecht replied. "The sealing simply prevented dissipation." "But why is it increasing?" Berg pressed. "Something must be driving it. A power source. There is no power source." "Then something in that device is continuing a reaction at the atomic level." "Or," Hecht said, voice low and controlled, "we triggered a state of matter we were not prepared to contain." Berg fell silent. Because he knew Hecht was right. The experiment had crossed a threshold into unknown physical behavior. Something in the apparatus had interacted with the surrounding environment in a way no one predicted. And now the sealed chamber was acting like a reservoir of impossible cold. Cold that was escaping slowly but steadily. The question was no longer what had happened. The question was what would happen when the containment finally failed. At dawn, the first collapse occurred. A loud metallic pop echoed through the corridor. The upper corner of the welded seam tore open by 2 centimeters. A plume of cold mist spilled out, crawling along the ceiling before sinking to the floor like heavy smoke. The lights flickered. The temperature fell sharply. The frost spread outward in real time. Hecht ordered everyone back. Berg pressed himself against the wall, heart racing. From the widening crack in the door, a faint vibration resonated through the corridor. Not a hum, not like the morning of the experiment. This was slower, deeper, almost like the groan of shifting ice under a frozen lake. Hecht spoke one word. "Reinforce." But even he knew reinforcement would only delay the inevitable. Because what they were containing was no longer a malfunctioning device. It was the aftermath of a physical event that had no precedent. And whatever was changing inside that chamber was beginning to reach outward. The rupture in the chamber door did not widen further during the first hour after dawn, but the mist continued to seep through the narrow opening in steady, pulsing waves. Each pulse chilled the corridor several degrees, forcing the guards to retreat again and again. Their breath had become visible even through the thick air of the hallway. The lamps overhead dimmed each time the mist emerged, as though the phenomenon drew not only heat, but energy itself from the environment. At 07:15, Hecht convened an emergency meeting in one of the underground briefing rooms. The air was marginally warmer there, though still colder than usual. A kerosene heater had been brought inside, but seemed unable to lift the temperature above freezing. Everyone sat in heavy coats. Papers trembled slightly in the light draft, pushing under the door. Hecht stood at the head of the table, hands clasped behind him. His normally calm face carried a tension that none of the engineers had seen before. "We are facing an escalating reaction," he began. "The chamber will fail completely. The only question is when." The officers exchanged uneasy looks. "Evacuation?" someone suggested. "No," Hecht replied. "Not until we understand what we are dealing with. Relocation under unknown physical conditions could make the situation worse. We contain it here." A physicist from the Luftwaffe research unit spoke next. "If the reaction is absorbing thermal energy, then a collapse may release that energy unpredictably." "Or," another countered, "it may continue absorbing until it stabilizes at a lower equilibrium." "And what is that equilibrium?" Hecht asked sharply. No one answered. Hecht turned to Berg. "Report your calculations." Berg rose slowly, placing a stack of handwritten sheets on the table. Based on temperature decline rates and structural deformation, internal pressure is fluctuating. Not mechanical pressure, spatial pressure. Something is warping the chamber's boundaries. The room fell silent. The physicist frowned. "Impossible." Berg continued anyway. "The mist behaves like condensed air displaced by extreme cold, but its flow isn't dictated by temperature gradients alone. It pulses, rhythmic, almost intentional." "Are you suggesting intelligence?" one of the officers demanded. "No," Berg answered quickly. "Not intelligence, but some form of feedback cycle, as if the phenomenon is stabilizing itself." Hecht walked slowly around the table. "If what you are describing is accurate, then we must assume the chamber is no longer isolating the event. The facility's integrity is at risk." The physicist cleared his throat. "Sir, we need more data." That statement hung in the air like a challenge. More data meant one thing. Someone had to approach the chamber. Within the hour, a small team gathered outside the sealed door, their boots crunching on ice that had grown thicker overnight. The frost now covered nearly the entire length of the corridor. The glow of the lamps reflected off crystalline surfaces, filling the area with a dim blue light. Berg tightened the straps of his insulated mask. It wouldn't protect him from unknown radiation or anomalous forces, but it might help with the bitter cold. Hecht stood to the side, observing. "Measure temperature at half-meter intervals," he instructed. "Check structural integrity of the welds. Do not touch the door directly, and if the mist increases, retreat." The technicians nodded, though their eyes betrayed their fear. Berg stepped forward first. At a distance of 2 meters from the door, his thermometer dropped so sharply that the display fogged from within. He tapped the casing. Nothing changed. "-40, he said. "External?" Hecht asked. "Yes, sir. Surface temperature, outer door." "Internal projection?" Berg glanced again. "-80. One technician muttered a curse under his breath. Berg approached closer, holding a long metal probe attached to a cable. He pressed it gently against the wall beside the door. Frost immediately spidered across the probe's surface, racing toward his hand until he yanked it back. "Structural rigidity decreasing," he reported. "The metal is losing cohesion. The welds may not hold another day." "And the mist?" Hecht asked. Berg looked into the narrow rupture. The mist drifted outward in soft, irregular waves. But something else caught his eye. Light. Not from the corridor lamps, not from reflection. A faint glow coming from inside the chamber. Blue-white, soft but steady, like phosphorescence under deep water. "Sir," Berg whispered, "there's illumination inside." The technicians turned their flashlights toward the gap. The beams bent, not reflected, not scattered. Bent, curved slightly toward the rupture, as though drawn inward. "Retreat," Hecht ordered. "Now." They backed away quickly. When the team reached a safer distance, Berg removed his mask, breath shaking. "That wasn't residual equipment. Something in there is active." "The machine?" an officer asked. "No," Berg said quietly. "The machine was not capable of emitting light." Hecht studied him for a moment. "Prepare for partial access." Everyone stared at him. "That chamber is failing," Hecht continued. "If we do nothing, it will collapse uncontrolled. A controlled breach is our only chance to understand what is happening." Berg felt his chest tighten. A controlled breach meant opening the door. Even slightly could be catastrophic. But he also knew Hecht was right. The situation was deteriorating by the hour. The preparations took all afternoon. Engineers brought portable heaters to counteract temperature shock. SS personnel erected containment screens and sealed off the corridor with heavy tarps lined with lead foil. Physicists calibrated instruments to detect electromagnetic variance, ionization levels, and structural resonance. By dusk, a small group of specialists gathered at the far end of the corridor, their breath forming thick clouds. Hecht addressed them directly. "No one enters the chamber. We will widen the rupture by no more than 3 centimeters. We observe. We measure. If any parameter spikes, any parameter, you fall back immediately. Am I clear?" The men nodded. Berg felt his hands tremble slightly as he adjusted his gloves. He wasn't sure whether it was the cold or anticipation. A pneumatic cutter was positioned against the upper corner of the broken seam. The blade vibrated softly, sending faint echoes along the corridor walls. "Begin," Hecht ordered. The cutter activated. Sparks flew, then froze mid-air. They didn't fall. They didn't drift. They crystallized into tiny shards and struck the floor like glass beads. The cutter operator shut the tool off, stepping back in alarm. Berg stared. Even motion was behaving differently near the rupture. Hecht did not flinch. "Continue." The operator tried again, angling the cutter at a different point. The blade pressed into the metal, but instead of slicing through, the steel fractured along a natural fault line, splitting open with a brittle crack. The rupture widened slightly. Cold mist burst out in a dense plume, rolling across the ceiling and cascading down the walls. The lights dimmed nearly to blackness before stabilizing at a faint glow. Berg raised his light toward the opening. And then he saw it. The chamber interior was covered in frost, but not ordinary frost. Geometric patterns, sharp, angular shapes, spread across the walls as if etched with mathematical precision. The air inside shimmered with tiny particles suspended in motionless equilibrium. The machine stood in the center, but its coils were no longer intact. They had partially collapsed inward, as if pulled by some force. The glow emanated from the gap between those coils, a pulsing core of blue-white luminescence. The physicist beside Berg gasped. That's impossible." The light wasn't uniform. It twisted slightly, forming slow spirals, not chaotic, structured, a field, a geometry, a phenomenon. "Retreat," Hecht said quietly, slowly. But Berg didn't move. The light was mesmerizing, not warm, not cold, just alien. He took one careful step closer. The mist parted around him, swirling in slow waves. "Berg!" Hecht snapped. "Back!" Berg blinked, finally stepping away. His heart pounded. He hadn't even realized he had moved. The team retreated to the safer zone near the containment screens. Berg removed his mask, gasping for air. The physicist spoke first. "This is not a field collapse. This is a stable configuration. The device triggered something self-organizing." Hecht looked at Berg. "You said yesterday the reaction might be stabilizing." "Yes," Berg whispered. "But I didn't expect this." Hecht's voice remained ice calm. "We need to understand how stable it is, and whether it is expanding." Before anyone could respond, the corridor lights flickered again. This time they didn't recover. Darkness swept across the hallway. A moment later, a low, resonant vibration rolled through the structure, deep and distant, like thunder under the earth. The mist beneath the chamber door began to shift, not flowing outward, flowing inward, as if something inside the chamber was inhaling. Panic rippled through the team. "Fall back!" Hecht shouted. "Full retreat to secondary containment!" Men grabbed instruments, stumbling over the icy floor. Berg felt the cold creeping into his joints, numbing his fingers. The mist swirled violently now, moving in patterns no natural air current could produce. As he turned to run, he glanced over his shoulder. The glow inside the chamber brightened. Not a flare, not an explosion, a steady increase, like the rising of a distant sun. Then, for the first time since the experiment began, Berg heard sound. A low harmonic tone. Not mechanical, not electrical, a resonance, the same pulse the mist followed, but now louder, almost deliberate. When they reached the far end of the corridor, Hecht slammed the containment door shut behind them. Men panted, coughing from the cold and fear. Berg leaned against the wall, breath trembling. "We need to shut down power to the entire wing," he said. "If that field couples with the electrical grid, we already have," Hecht replied. "This section is isolated." The physicist shook his head. "Then whatever we just saw is not drawing from the facility. It has its own energy source." Hecht stared at the sealed containment door. The dim emergency lights painted long shadows across his face. "Prepare evacuation protocols," he said quietly, "and burn all documentation unrelated to essential observation. No records of this project can survive." "But sir," Hecht cut him off, "this experiment is to be buried. Permanently." Berg swallowed hard. Because he understood now. Whatever had formed inside that chamber was not merely dangerous, it was unprecedented. And if it breached containment fully, no one could predict what the final state of the phenomenon would be. The evacuation order did not spread across Kummersdorf with sirens or shouted commands. It moved quietly, through sealed memos, coded instructions, and brief, tense conversations between officers who avoided making eye contact. By midday, non-essential personnel had already begun leaving the facility in small groups, escorted by SS guards who offered no explanation. But the wing containing Experiment 46 was not evacuated. Instead, it was fortified. Thick steel doors, normally used only during munitions testing, were rolled into place along the adjoining corridors. Engineers bolted them shut, then welded additional braces across the frames. A secondary containment barrier was erected outside the first, with lead-lined panels and heavy rubber seals. Floodlights were installed along the ceiling, though no one could keep them burning longer than a few minutes before they dimmed to faint glows. The phenomenon inside the chamber, whatever it was, affected electrical systems in unpredictable ways. At 0940, Hecht walked the fortified corridor with two officers, his boots echoing against the frozen floor. The air was so cold now that frost formed instantly on the exposed metal of their belt buckles. Ice crystals drifted gently in the dim light, floating in slow, lazy arcs that defied the usual movements of air. Berg waited at the far end, clutching a clipboard filled with new measurements. His fingers had gone numb long before he reached the halfway point of the corridor. Hecht approached him with his usual controlled stride. "Report." "Temperature continues to drop," Berg said. "In the last 2 hours, the corridor fell another 12 degrees. The frost is advancing roughly 1 meter every 90 minutes. Structural stability? The door will not last the day." Hecht showed no surprise. "And the internal readings?" Berg hesitated. "The light inside the chamber is increasing in intensity, slowly, steadily." "Frequency?" "Low, harmonic. The pattern is repeating every 14 seconds. Hecht raised an eyebrow. "Consistent oscillation?" "Yes, sir." The physicist beside Berg spoke in a low, uncertain voice. "That indicates a self-regulating field. It's maintaining coherence." Hecht turned to him. "Does that imply expansion?" "We don't know," the physicist admitted. "But the breach in the door may not be the only point of emergence. Spatial distortions can propagate through material if—" Hecht cut him off. "No speculation, only observation." A faint, distant vibration rolled through the corridor, then, Subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable to anyone who had stood near the chamber the day before. The mist thickened near the rupture, swirling in unnatural spirals. The light behind the door pulsed, casting a faint blue shadows across the ice-covered walls. Hecht straightened. "Prepare the suppression unit." The officers at his side stiffened. One of them spoke cautiously. "Sir, using the suppression protocols without understanding the phenomenon could cause collapse. Or it could contain it," Hecht replied. Berg swallowed. The suppression unit was not a single device. It was a set of emergency measures designed to neutralize hazardous experimental reactions. High-pressure nitrogen tanks, chemical foam, thermal dampening blankets, in extreme cases, even explosive bolts meant to collapse a sealed test chamber inward. But applying any of that to a phenomenon they barely understood was reckless. Still, they had no alternative. By early afternoon, the suppression team assembled outside the fortified barrier. They wore insulated protective suits normally used for extreme cryogenic testing. Their movements were slow, stiff, almost mechanical. The corridor's lights flickered overhead as the temperature continued its steady decline. Berg watched as they unloaded equipment onto reinforced carts. Coiled hoses, heavy canisters, massive thermal blankets lined with reflective foil. The air hummed with tension. "Your objective," Hecht told the team commander, "is to halt the advance of the frost and stabilize the breach. You are not to attempt entry into the chamber. You will approach to within 1 meter of the rupture and no closer." The commander nodded. His visor hid whatever expression came to his face. "What if the phenomenon reacts?" he asked quietly. "Then you fall back immediately," Hecht said, "and seal the corridor behind you." Berg felt the weight of those words. Seal the corridor behind you, a directive that implied acceptable loss. The team advanced slowly. Their boots cracked the ice. Their heated hoses hissed as steam rose into the frigid air. The mist around the chamber doorway shifted subtly, as if sensing the movement. At 1 meter from the breach, the commander raised his hand. The hoses activated fully, releasing torrents of superheated vapor that enveloped the frost-covered surface. For a moment, the corridor filled with white fog. The ice crackled under the heat, fracturing into sharp, glass-like shards. The breach expanded slightly as the metal contracted unevenly. Then the vapor cleared. Berg stared, unable to believe what he was seeing. The frost had returned. Instantly, thicker than before. It wasn't resisting the heat. It was consuming it. Hecht stepped forward. Again. The team repeated the process. Steam, hiss, crack, whiteout. And again. The frost reappeared. Denser, colder. The patterns on the metal more intricate, almost crystalline in their precision. The physicist whispered, "It's absorbing thermal energy to maintain structure. This is not passive freezing, it's active stabilization." Hecht ignored the comment. "Commence chemical foam." The suppression team switched to their secondary measure. Thick, pressurized foam meant to smother volatile reactions. It splashed across the door and the surrounding wall in a heavy cascade, clinging to every surface. For a moment, the frost receded. And then, a low pulse emanated from within the chamber. The foam began to crystallize. Starting at the top, then cascading downward, the substance hardened into a rigid shell of pale, translucent ice. The suppression commander stepped back sharply. "Retreat!" he shouted. "Fall back!" The team withdrew rapidly, dragging equipment with them. The frost surged outward, reclaiming every inch of ground they had won. The chemical foam had not hindered the phenomenon. It had fed it. The retreat was chaotic. Men stumbled over the uneven ice. One slipped so hard he skidded across the floor and injured his arm. Another's hose froze solid in his hands, splitting open with a brittle crack. Berg reached Hecht first. "We can't suppress it. Every attempt strengthens the reaction." Hecht kept his expression unreadable, but his voice was lower, harsher than before. "Then we accelerate containment collapse." The physicist paled. "Sir, if you collapse the chamber, the reaction could escape uncontrolled." "And if we do nothing," Hecht replied, "it will escape anyway." Silence followed. A silence thick with dread. Hecht turned to Berg. "Calculate structural failure time. We need a window." Berg nodded shakily and hurried back toward the mobile instruments they had set up along the corridor. His calculations were not simple. The metal fatigue rate, the cold propagation speed, the stress differential from the harmonic pulses. All variables pushed toward the same conclusion. Hecht approached him minutes later. "Well?" Berg looked up, face pale. "By nightfall. No later." Hecht closed his eyes briefly, not in fear, but in acceptance. "Prepare the charges." Berg froze. "Sir, you mean to collapse the chamber now, before the reaction stabilizes?" "Yes." "But if the phenomenon is anchored to the device," Hecht cut him off sharply. "The device no longer matters. The reaction is self-sustaining. Our only option is to bury it." Berg wanted to argue, wanted to explain the risk, wanted to say that no one understood what would happen if the chamber collapsed. But he saw something in Hecht's eyes, a rare, unmistakable flicker of fear, and he knew the decision was final. Setting the demolition charges took hours. The frost made every bolt brittle, every cable stiff, every surface treacherous. The engineers worked slowly, dragging heavy crates through the icy corridor. The bomb units were small, designed to implode a confined structure rather than explode outward. Berg oversaw placement while Hecht supervised every step. The physicist monitored the harmonic pulses from a distance, tracking their increasing intensity. As dusk approached, the corridor darkened. The emergency lamps flickered weakly, painting faint streaks of yellow across the ice. From the breach in the chamber door, the blue-white glow brightened steadily, pulsing with greater force. The demolition team stepped back. The charges were set. Hecht took a final look at the sealed door. It was no longer a door. It was a boundary, a thin wall between the known world and something that did not belong in it. "Clear the wing," Hecht said quietly. The last men retreated past the secondary containment barrier. The door shut behind them with a heavy, echoing thud. In the dim control room beyond, Hecht placed his hand over the activation switch. "On my signal," he said. Berg stood beside him, heart hammering. A deep pulse rolled through the walls. The lights flickered violently. "Now," Hecht said. He brought his hand down. The charges detonated. A deep, crushing roar reverberated through the corridor. Metal screamed. Concrete cracked. The entire wing trembled with the force of implosion. Then, silence. Total silence. A silence so deep it felt unnatural. The implosion shook the entire underground wing. Dust rained from ceiling joints. Frost shattered into fragments that skittered across the floor like broken glass. Then, as suddenly as the roar had erupted, it disappeared, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating stillness. In the control room, Berg braced himself against the console. The air felt wrong, too calm, too empty, as though the silence itself had a mass. A faint echo vibrated through the reinforced door, then faded completely. Hecht lowered his hand from the switch. "Wait for pressure equalization," he said quietly. The physicist stared at the readings. "Sir, the harmonic signature. It's gone." "Gone," Hecht repeated, his tone unreadable. "No oscillations, no pulses, no field activity, nothing." Berg exhaled in relief, then quickly stopped himself. It was too soon to feel relief. Hecht looked at the steel-reinforced observation slit. "Prepare a reconnaissance team." Within minutes, men in insulated suits gathered behind the sealed barrier. Frost had already begun forming along the doorframe, despite the thick insulation. Hecht supervised every preparation, speaking in short, clipped commands. "Slow approach. Full visual confirmation before any personnel advance. No touching the chamber remains." The containment door groaned as it opened. A cold wind swept in, colder than before, but lacking the rhythmic pulse that had haunted the previous days. The corridor ahead lay in darkness. Only faint glimmers of reflected light danced across the icy floor. The reconnaissance team advanced with flashlights raised. The corridor they entered no longer resembled a functioning research wing. It looked like the inside of a glacier. Thick ice covered the walls in jagged, irregular formations. The floor had warped from the force of the implosion, creating uneven slopes and fractures. The lamps overhead hung crookedly, their wiring encased in frozen sheaths. Each step the men took echoed unnaturally, as though the sound didn't know where to travel. Berg followed cautiously, his breath forming clouds inside his mask. He kept waiting, expecting to feel the subtle vibrations of the harmonic field. But there was nothing. No resonance, no pulse, no glow. The most terrifying thing about the space was its silence. When they reached the outer frame of the former chamber, they realized what the implosion had done. The structure had collapsed inward, flattening the inner walls and burying the apparatus under tons of twisted metal. The frost radiated outward from the center in intricate patterns, forming crystalline spirals and geometric lines, unnervingly similar to the shapes they had seen inside the chamber before the implosion. The physicist crouched, examining the ice with a gloved hand. These patterns, they were not created by temperature alone. Something oriented them. Hecht stepped closer. "Is there any residual activity?" "None detectable," the physicist replied, "but these are not normal structures." Berg directed his flashlight toward the collapsed center. There was no glow, no movement, just frozen ruin. And yet, something felt wrong. The air directly above the implosion center shimmered faintly, as though the light were bending through a thin veil. Berg's breath caught. "Sir, look." Hecht followed the beam of his flashlight. A distortion, subtle, almost imperceptible, like heat haze, but in air that was far below freezing. "Back away," Hecht said immediately. "Slowly." The team stepped back, boots crunching over frost. As they moved, the faint distortion flickered once and disappeared. The physicist spoke in a trembling voice. "It's residual, a collapse remnant. The field might be gone, but space itself hasn't normalized." Berg stared into the icy hollow. So the implosion had worked, but not completely. Something had been left behind. Not active, not dangerous, at least not now, but present. A scar. A reminder that the chamber had held something physics was not meant to accommodate. The next 48 hours passed in controlled urgency. The entire wing was sealed permanently. Additional steel plates were welded over the remains of the chamber. Engineers layered concrete across every surface, while SS units guarded the corridor around the clock. No one spoke above a whisper. No one asked questions. Hecht supervised the operation with a severity bordering on obsession. He verified every weld, every anchor point, every structural reinforcement. When one engineer hesitated near the sealed center, Hecht pulled him back sharply. No one approaches that point without direct orders. Ever. By the end of the second night, the chamber was entombed beneath a thick shell of reinforced concrete. The frost had been melted, scraped away, and chemically neutralized. New ventilation systems were installed to control temperature. A steel door, far heavier than the original, was bolted and welded into position, then buried under another plate. The wing was dead, sealed, erased. Only the people who had been present knew what lay beneath the concrete, and none of them would ever be allowed to speak of it. 3 days after the implosion, Berg was summoned to Hecht's office. The room was warmer than the corridors, but only slightly. The lamp on Hecht's desk flickered weakly. Hecht gestured for him to sit. "Your report," he said. Berg handed over a folder containing his findings: temperature logs, structural analysis, harmonic signatures, field collapse projections. Hecht skimmed each page with unreadable calm. "You believe the phenomenon reached a stable termination?" Hecht asked. "Yes," Berg said cautiously. "There are no indications of continuing activity." "And the distortion?" Berg hesitated. "It appears residual, like a footprint, but incomplete." "Incomplete?" Hecht echoed. "Residual patterns of spatial stress," Berg said. "They do not propagate. They do not fluctuate. They simply exist, like a memory of the field." Hecht closed the folder. "And will it decay?" "Over time," Berg said, "but we cannot predict how long." Hecht studied him quietly. "You did well," he said at last. "I will ensure your contribution is noted internally." Berg nodded, unsure whether the words were meant as praise or closure. Hecht then slid a single document across the desk. "Sign." Berg read the page. It stated that he had participated in the containment of a routine mechanical malfunction, that no anomalies had been observed, and that no classified technologies had been compromised. It was a lie, a precise, deliberate, carefully engineered lie. And the signature line bore a clear warning: non-disclosure violation is punishable by death. Berg signed. Hecht stood. "This project is over. You will return to your previous assignments. You will not discuss this incident, even among those present." Berg nodded. Hecht added quietly, "History must not remember what happened here." 2 weeks later, Berg walked the snowy grounds of the Kummersdorf facility. The winter air bit at his face, but compared to the cold he had felt inside the sealed wing, it was almost warm. He passed the structure where Experiment 46 had once stood. From the outside, it looked ordinary now, just another concrete bunker, identical to dozens scattered around the compound. But Berg knew. Beneath that concrete lay the remnants of an experiment that had crossed a threshold physics was not ready to confront. A device that had triggered a phenomenon which had no name. A field that had stabilized itself, reached outwards, and left behind patterns that would trouble him for years. He paused, staring at the seam between the concrete plates. Snow had begun to gather along the edges, hiding the welds. No light, no mist, no sound. Yet deep inside the structure, Berg thought he felt, just for a moment, the faintest pressure behind the air. A whisper of tension. A memory of the harmonic pulse. Then it was gone. He turned away and walked across the snow, leaving the sealed chamber behind him. The wind swept across the compound, erasing his footprints as quickly as he made them. By spring, the wing would be abandoned entirely. By summer, transferred research teams would scatter across other facilities. By autumn, most records of Experiment 46 would be burned in controlled archival purges. Only a tiny handful of men would ever remember what had happened. And they would never speak of it. Not because they were forbidden, but because they did not want to remember. Some experiments fail. Some succeed in ways no one intended. But this one went so wrong that it was not merely buried, it was erased completely.